When I stepped into the boardroom of Horizon Energy as its new CEO, my estranged husband nearly choked on his coffee. Patrick had abandoned me 6 months pregnant for his assistant. Now he was just another executive awaiting my orders. His face drained of color when I announced the company-wide restructuring, starting with his department. The nameplate on my desk read, Miranda Reynolds, Chief Executive Officer. The same last name he had tried to erase from his life when he walked out, on me and our unborn daughter. Now, as I settled into the leather chair at the head of the conference table, I savored the irony. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woman he'd deemed too emotional to handle corporate pressure was now controlling the fate of his career. The boardroom of Horizon Energy's headquarters felt strangely familiar, though I'd never set foot in it before today. Perhaps it was because Patrick had described it so many times during our marriage. The mahogany table he claimed was the center of his universe, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline he was so proud to command. Back then, he'd made it clear this world would never be mine to inhabit. Let me introduce myself properly, I began, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath my professional veneer. For those who haven't met me yet, I'm Miranda Reynolds, appointed by the board as your new CEO following the retirement of Bill Hargrove. I could feel Patrick's eyes boring into me from his seat halfway down the table. 7 years had passed, since that rainy February night when he'd packed his things, telling me his assistant Aileen made him feel alive in ways I never could. 7 years since he'd looked at my swollen belly and told me he wasn't cut out for fatherhood, after all. As many of you know, Horizon Energy faces significant challenges, I continued, pulling up the first slide of my presentation. Our renewable division is underperforming, our traditional energy assets are depreciating faster than projected, and our corporate culture. I paused, allowing my gaze to meet Patrick's directly for the first time, has developed certain toxicities that need immediate addressing. Patrick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As Vice President of Operations, he'd been responsible for the very divisions I was now critiquing. The same divisions that, according to my extensive research, he'd been deliberately mismanaging to justify budget increases that primarily benefited his own projects and bonuses. Before we dive into the specifics of my restructuring plan, I'd like to share a bit about my vision for Horizon's future, I said, clicking to the next slide. I believe in transparent leadership, merit-based advancement, and creating an environment where innovation thrives regardless of whose idea it is. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the room. Patrick's management style was notorious for claiming credit for others' ideas while publicly criticizing their shortcomings. His face had grown increasingly pale as I spoke, no doubt connecting the dots between my vision and his approaching downfall. Ms. Reynolds, Frank Wilson, the chief financial officer, interjected. Your credentials are certainly impressive, but I'm curious about your specific experience in the energy sector. I smiled, having anticipated this question from Patrick's closest ally in the company. A fair question, Mr. Wilson. After completing my MBA at Wharton, I spent 5 years at Green Tech Innovations, where I spearheaded their transition to sustainable energy solutions, resulting in a 46% increase in profitability. For the past 2 years, I've been consulting for Meridian Power, restructuring their operations model to accommodate the rapid changes in our industry. I didn't add that I'd completed my MBA while raising our daughter Lily alone, or that I'd built my career working primarily from home so I could be present for her early years. Those details weren't relevant to my qualifications, though they spoke volumes about my determination. What about your connection to Patrick Reynolds? Carrie Mitchell, head of human resources, asked bluntly. I believe you two were previously acquainted. The room went silent. Patrick visibly stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his pen. Yes, Mr. Reynolds and I have a past association, I replied calmly. However, I was selected by the board based solely on my professional qualifications. I assure you all that personal history will not influence my business decisions. A small lie. Personal history had indeed influenced one decision, my acceptance of this particular CEO position when I'd had several offers. But my plans for Horizon Energy extended far beyond settling old scores with Patrick. Now, let's move on to the first phase of our restructuring, I said, clicking to a detailed organizational chart. As you can see, several departments will be consolidated to eliminate redundancies. The operations division will be divided into two segments: traditional energy operations and renewable innovation. Patrick's face darkened as he saw his empire being split in half. For years, he'd kept the renewables division underfunded and understaffed, focusing resources on the traditional energy operations that provided quicker returns and bigger bonuses. By separating them, I was shining a spotlight on his deliberate sabotage of the company's future. These changes take effect immediately, I continued. Abigail Porter will head renewable innovation, while operations will temporarily report directly to me until we find suitable leadership. Patrick's head snapped up. Temporarily, I'm the VP of operations. These divisions have been under my management for 5 years. I met his gaze steadily. And during those 5 years, our renewable energy initiatives have fallen 37% behind industry standards, while our competitors have doubled their investments in the future. The board feels a fresh perspective is needed. What I didn't say was that I'd spent weeks reviewing every decision Patrick had made, identifying patterns of self-serving choices at the company's expense. The board hadn't needed much convincing. Once they saw the data, Frank Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This seems rather drastic for your first day, Ms. Reynolds. Perhaps a transition period would be more appropriate. I smiled politely. The energy market waits for no one, Mr. Wilson. Every day we delay is a day our competitors move further ahead. Now, shall we continue with the presentation, or would you prefer to register a formal objection with the board? Berkey. Challenge hung in the air. Frank's objection revealed more than he intended. He and Patrick had clearly expected to manage me, to slow-walk any changes I proposed. They'd underestimated me, just as Patrick had 7 years ago when he walked out, assuming I'd crumble without him. No objection, Frank muttered after a moment's hesitation. Please continue. I nodded and moved to the next slide, outlining my plans for expanding our renewable portfolio. As I spoke, I noticed several of the younger executives leaning forward, engaged and excited by the vision I was presenting. They'd likely had similar ideas shot down by Patrick over the years. One final announcement before we adjourn, I said as the presentation concluded. I've reviewed the pending promotions list, and I've noticed some concerning patterns. Effective immediately, all promotions and advancement will be reviewed by a committee rather than individual department heads to ensure decisions are based on merit rather than personal relationships. Patrick's jaw clenched visibly. His latest mistress, Corey from marketing, had been on the fast track for a promotion she was notably underqualified for. This new policy would effectively end his practice of rewarding loyalty over competence and eliminate his primary method of collecting allies within the company. That concludes our initial overview, I said, closing my laptop. You'll all receive detailed documentation of these changes by end of day. Department heads, please schedule individual meetings with my assistant to discuss implementation specifics. Thank you for your attention. As the executives filed out, murmuring among themselves, Patrick remained seated, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. When the last person had left, he closed the boardroom door and turned to face me. "What the hell is this, Miranda?" he demanded, his voice low but intense. "Some elaborate revenge scheme? You destroyed our marriage and now you're coming after my career?" I laughed, the sound sharp and incredulous. I destroyed our marriage? That's an interesting revision of history, Patrick. I seem to recall you were the one who left your pregnant wife for your 24-year-old assistant. That's ancient history. he dismissed with a wave of his hand. This is about now. You deliberately sought out this position to undermine me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I gathered my materials calmly, refusing to be baited into an emotional response. The board approached me, Patrick. Not the other way around. They've been concerned about the direction of the company for some time. My appointment is about saving Horizon Energy, not settling personal scores. You expect me to believe that's a coincidence? He scoffed. Out of all the energy companies in the country, you just happen to end up at mine? Yours, I echoed, raising an eyebrow. This is a publicly traded company, Patrick, not your personal kingdom. And yes, when Bill Hargrove reached out to me after we met at the Energy Innovation Summit last year, I was intrigued by the opportunity. The fact that you work here was a complication, not a motivation. Patrick's face flushed with anger. You won't get away with this. The board might be temporarily impressed with your fancy presentations and MBA jargon, but they'll see through you eventually. You're out of your depth here, Miranda. You always were. I smiled, remembering how he'd said almost those exact words the night he left. You're out of your depth in this marriage, Miranda. You always were. Some women aren't cut out for balancing family and ambition. We'll see, I replied simply. Results speak louder than threats, Patrick. And unlike you, I intend to deliver actual results, not just inflated projections designed to boost my bonus. His eyes narrowed. You think you know everything about this company based on some spreadsheets and quarterly reports? I've built relationships here for a decade. People are loyal to me. Are they loyal to you or afraid of you? I countered. There's a difference. But we'll find out soon enough, won't we? I moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Patrick? I've arranged for your office to be relocated to the East Wing. As a department head rather than a VP, you'll be closer to your team. Your new office will be ready by tomorrow morning. His face contorted with fury. You can't demote me without cause. I'll go to the board. The restructuring eliminated your position, I replied smoothly. You weren't demoted. Your role was redefined. All perfectly standard procedure during a corporate reorganization. The paperwork has already been approved by the board. This isn't over, he growled as I opened the door. I turned back one last time. You're right about that, Patrick. It's just beginning. As I walked through the executive floor toward what was now my office, I felt the weight of curious stares. Word had spread quickly about the new CEO and her connection to Patrick Reynolds. By tomorrow, everyone would know our history, or at least Patrick's version of it. But they would soon learn who I really was through my actions, not office gossip. The truth would emerge not in words but in results, in the way Horizon Energy would transform under my leadership. Patrick had always underestimated me, from the moment we met at that industry conference 8 years ago, to the night he walked out, certain I would fail without him. My assistant Abigail was waiting when I reached my office. Your daughter's school called, she said. Lily won her science competition. She wanted you to know right away. A smile spread across my face. A genuine one this time, not the calculated professional expression I'd maintained throughout the board meeting. Thank you, Abigail. Could you send flowers to her school? And let her know I'll take her out for celebration ice cream tonight. Of course, Abigail nodded. Also, the files you requested on the operations division's last 3 years of decision-making are on your desk, and Mr. Hargrove called to see how your first day is going. Tell Bill I said the transition is proceeding exactly as planned, I replied, settling behind my desk. As Abigail left, I turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows Patrick had so often bragged about. The view was indeed impressive. The city sprawled. Below, buildings catching the mid-morning light. But unlike Patrick, I didn't see it as a symbol of power or status. I saw possibilities, connections, futures to be built. I placed a framed photo on my desk. Lily at her 6th birthday party, her smile revealing a missing front tooth, her eyes bright with the same determination I'd relied on to get through those early days after Patrick left. Everything I'd accomplished had been for her, to show her that abandonment wasn't the end of our story, but the beginning of something stronger. Opening my laptop, I began reviewing the operations files, highlighting patterns that confirmed what I'd already suspected. Patrick had been systematically sabotaging renewable initiatives while promoting his allies and sidelining anyone who challenged him. The evidence was clear once you knew what to look for. My phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "Did you really become the boss of Daddy's company? Tommy in my class says his mom says you did." I smiled at her directness. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm the CEO now. We'll talk more over ice cream tonight." Putting my phone down, I turned back to the files. This wasn't about revenge, despite what Patrick thought. It was about transformation, of Horizon Energy, of the industry's approach to renewables, of the corporate culture that allowed men like Patrick to profit while damaging both the company and the planet's future. And if Patrick was finally forced to face the consequences of his actions along the way, that was simply justice, not revenge. The day stretched ahead, filled with meetings and decisions that would shape Horizon Energy's future. Patrick had once told me I'd never succeed without him. Now he would watch as I succeeded despite him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. That evening, as promised, I took Lily for celebration ice cream at Scoops, the little parlor 3 blocks from our apartment. At 7 years old, my daughter was already showing signs of the woman she would become. Fiercely intelligent, unafraid, to ask difficult questions, and possessing a quiet resilience that sometimes broke my heart. She had Patrick's eyes, but thankfully little else of him. "So you're really Daddy's boss now?" she asked, digging into her mint chocolate chip with methodical precision. She always saved the chocolate pieces for last. "I'm the boss of the whole company," I clarified. "Your dad is one of many people who work there." Lily considered this, her brow furrowing in that way that reminded me of myself. "Is that why he was so mad when he called Aunt Carrie today?" I paused, my spoon halfway to my mouth. "Your dad called Aunt Carrie?" Carrie Mitchell was my college roommate and closest friend, and apparently still my ex-husband's confidant despite their falling out after our divorce. Lily nodded, chocolate smeared at the corner of her mouth. "I heard her talking on the phone when she picked me up from school. She said you were being fair, and Daddy said you were being vindictive." The unexpected connection sent my mind racing. Carrie had never mentioned maintaining contact with Patrick after our divorce. As Horizon's HR director, she'd been instrumental in helping the board evaluate my candidacy for CEO. Had she been feeding Patrick information all along? Was she a potential ally or a hidden threat? "Well, people see things differently sometimes," I said carefully, wiping the chocolate from her chin. "What matters is doing what's right for the company. Like how you made me eat broccoli even though I hated it, because it was good for me?" Lily asked, her innocent question containing more wisdom than she realized. I smiled. "Exactly like that. Sometimes what's best isn't what's easiest." Later, after putting Lily to bed, I sat in my home office reviewing more Horizon Energy files. Our apartment was modest by CEO standards, a 3-bedroom in a good school district that I'd purchased after my promotion at Green Tech. I could afford something larger now, but stability for Lily had always been my priority. After Patrick left, I'd promised myself she would never again feel the ground shift beneath her feet. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on the promotion. Coffee tomorrow? There's something you should know. Bill." Hargrove, I frowned. Bill had officially retired last week after 30 years at Horizon's helm. His mentorship during the transition had been invaluable, but something in the wording of his message suggested this wasn't a social call. "Name the place and time," I responded. 20 minutes later, I found myself staring at a spreadsheet that didn't make sense. The Renewable Division's research funding appeared to have been diverted multiple times over the past year, not eliminated, but redirected through a maze of internal transfers that effectively rendered promising projects stillborn while maintaining the appearance of support on paper. The pattern was too sophisticated to be Patrick's work alone. He excelled at corporate politics, not creative accounting. This would have required cooperation from finance, which meant Frank Wilson was more deeply involved than I'd initially suspected. I leaned back in my chair, the implications becoming clear. What I'd walked into wasn't simply a case of Patrick's mismanagement or self-serving decisions. There was something systemic happening at Horizon Energy, something that might explain why the board had been so eager to bring in an outsider So, my phone buzzed again. Carrie. We need to talk about Patrick. Coffee before work tomorrow? The coincidence of both Carrie and Bill reaching out on my first day couldn't be ignored. I typed a response. 7 a.m., Bluebird Cafe? Her reply came immediately. See you there. Sleep eluded me that night as my mind raced through possibilities. I'd accepted the CEO position believing it was primarily a professional opportunity, a chance to lead an energy company through the critical transition to renewables. The fact that Patrick worked there had seemed like an ironic footnote, a personal hurdle to overcome. But now I wondered if I'd misunderstood the situation entirely. What if Patrick's position at Horizon wasn't incidental to my hiring, but central to it? What if the board had brought me in specifically because of our history, not despite it? The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I arrived, at Bluebird Cafe 20 minutes early. I chose a corner table with a view of both entrances, a habit I'd developed during the contentious divorce proceedings when Patrick's lawyers had attempted to catch me off guard multiple times. Carrie arrived precisely at 7, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that contrasted with her vibrant red hair. Our friendship had weathered Patrick's betrayal and the divorce, though our busy careers meant we saw each other less often than either of us would like. Still, I'd never doubted her loyalty, until Lily's comment yesterday. You look like you haven't slept, she said by way of greeting, sliding into the seat across from me. Hazard of the new job, I replied, studying her expression. You wanted to talk about Patrick? Carrie sighed, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. I should have told you he called me yesterday. He was livid about the restructuring, said you were using your position to settle an old score. And what did you tell him? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. That if he'd actually read any of the reports from the last 2 years, he'd know the restructuring was inevitable, regardless of who took the CEO position. She met my gaze directly. The Renewable Division has been systematically undermined. For years, Miranda. Not just by Patrick, but by a whole cadre of executives with investments in competing traditional energy companies. I blinked, taken aback by her frankness. You knew about this? I suspected, she corrected. HR sees patterns in promotions, demotions, transfers. When talented people in renewables kept getting sidelined while mediocre yes-men in traditional energy got fast-tracked, I started keeping notes. But I didn't have access to the financial data to prove anything. Relief washed over me. So you weren't feeding Patrick information? Confusion crossed her face. What? God, no. Why would you think that? Lily overheard your call with him yesterday. It sounded like you two were still in regular contact. Carrie's expression shifted to understanding. That was the first time he's called me in years, Miranda. He was fishing for information about your appointment. Wanted to know if I'd had advance warning, if there was a way to contest it. I shut him down. I nodded, some of my tension easing. I found something last night. Evidence that renewable research funds have been diverted. It's too sophisticated to be Patrick's work alone. Frank Wilson, Carrie said immediately. He and Patrick have been thick as thieves for years. Frank's brother-in-law runs Titan Petroleum. The pieces were falling into place. So they've been deliberately sabotaging Horizon's renewable initiatives to protect outside investments in fossil fuels. Carrie nodded grimly. That would be my guess, but you'd need solid proof before taking it to the board. Which is why Bill Hargrove wants to meet with me this morning, I said, the realization dawning. He must have suspected something too. Bill was always smarter than he let on, Carrie agreed. But Miranda, if this is true, you need to be careful. These people have millions at stake. They won't just accept your authority and step aside. I never expected them to, I replied, thinking of Patrick's thinly veiled threat in the boardroom. But I didn't realize I was walking into a corporate conspiracy rather than just an awkward reunion with my ex. Carrie leaned forward, her expression serious. Is that going to change your approach? Now that you know what you're really dealing with? I considered this. The professional challenge was far greater than I'd anticipated, the personal element more complex. What I'd thought would be a straightforward corporate turnaround with the added satisfaction of proving Patrick wrong was revealing itself to be something darker and more dangerous. No, I said finally. It just means I need to be more strategic about how I dismantle their operation. Instead of a simple restructuring, we're looking at a potential criminal investigation. Carrie's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. Patrick's called an emergency meeting of the operations team for 8:30. He's not wasting any time trying to consolidate his position. Let him, I said, a plan already forming. The more desperate he gets, the more mistakes he'll make. As we left the cafe, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective in the early morning light. I felt a strange calm settling over me, the same determination that had carried me through the darkest days after Patrick's betrayal. Back then, I'd channeled my pain into building a new life for Lily and myself. Now I would channel it into saving Horizon Energy from the corruption that Patrick and his allies had sown. I didn't take this job for revenge, I told Carrie as we parted on the sidewalk. But I won't pretend there isn't a certain poetic justice in being the one to expose what Patrick's been doing. Just be careful, she warned again. Patrick knows all your buttons, how to make you angry, how to make you doubt yourself. Don't let him use your history against you. I nodded, though privately I wondered if Patrick knew me at all anymore. The woman he'd abandoned, emotional, insecure, desperately trying to balance impending motherhood with career ambitions, no longer existed. In her place stood someone he'd never truly seen, a woman who had transformed pain into purpose, who had built her career not despite being a single mother, but drawing strength from it. Patrick had always underestimated me. Now that mistake would cost him everything he valued: his position, his reputation, and the corrupt system he'd helped create at Horizon Energy. As I entered the gleaming headquarters building, employees nodded respectfully, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Horizon's polished surface. My second day as CEO was about to begin, and with it, the real battle for the company's future. I arrived at Horizon Energy headquarters 30 minutes before my scheduled meeting with Bill Hargrove. The morning sun glinted off the steel and glass tower, illuminating the company logo, a stylized H with rays emanating from it, meant to symbolize energy innovation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company that had once promised to revolutionize renewable energy had been secretly sabotaging its own future. My new executive assistant, Abigail Porter, waited for me at the elevator with a tablet in hand and determination in her eyes. I'd specifically requested her for this role after reviewing personnel files and discovering Patrick had twice blocked her promotion despite stellar performance reviews. "Good morning, Ms. Reynolds," she said, falling into step beside me as we headed toward my office. "I've gathered the files you requested on the Renewable Division's funding history, and Mr. Hargrove is already waiting in your office." "Thank you, Abigail," I replied, setting a brisk pace. "After my meeting with Bill, I'll need to see the operational assessment for Mr. Reynolds' department from the last 3 quarters. The raw data, not the summarized reports. Already on your desk," she said with the hint of a smile. And I've taken the liberty of highlighting the discrepancies between the raw numbers and what was presented to the board. I glanced at her with newfound appreciation. You've been tracking these issues yourself? Let's just say some of us have been waiting a long time for someone to notice what's been happening, she replied carefully. The office that now belonged to me still bore traces of Bill Hargrove's 30-year tenure. The weathered leather furniture, the old-fashioned globe bar in the corner, the collection of industry awards lining one wall. But I'd made one significant change. Where Bill had displayed photographs of himself with politicians and industry leaders, I'd placed a single picture of Lily on her first day of school, her smile radiating confidence despite the difficult circumstances of our life. Bill rose from the visitor's chair as I entered, his imposing height somewhat diminished by age, but his shrewd eyes as sharp as ever. At 68, he still commanded respect throughout the industry, making his endorsement of my appointment crucial to my acceptance by Horizon's old guard. Miranda, he greeted me, extending his hand. Congratulations again on your first day. I hear you made quite an impression. Thank you, Bill, I replied, shaking his hand firmly before settling behind my desk. But I suspect you didn't come here for small talk, he chuckled, resuming his seat. Direct as always. It's why I recommended you for this position. His expression grew serious. I assume you've started to notice certain irregularities in our financial reporting? Particularly regarding the renewable division, I confirmed. Funds allocated but never actually deployed. Promising projects mysteriously stalled, talent reassigned or pushed out, and all of it concealed through creative accounting. Bill nodded grimly. I began noticing patterns about 2 years ago. Subtle at first, then increasingly brazen. But by the time I had enough evidence to take to the board, I discovered something even more troubling. He leaned forward. 3 board members have financial ties to competing traditional energy companies. The revelation didn't surprise me, as much as it should have. Is that why you retired rather than confronting the issue directly? Partially, he admitted. But mostly because I realized Horizon needed someone completely outside the existing power structure. Someone with the skills to turn the company around and the personal motivation to expose what's been happening, regardless of the consequences. I raised an eyebrow. Personal motivation? Bill's weathered face broke into a knowing smile. Don't misunderstand me, Miranda. Your qualifications are impeccable. But when I saw your name on the short list of candidates, I recognized an opportunity. Patrick Reynolds has been the linchpin in this corruption. Who better to dismantle his operation than the woman he underestimated so severely? The realization hit me with surprising force. You knew about our history. Energy is a small world, he replied with a shrug. People talk, especially about a rising star like yourself who managed to earn an MBA while raising a child alone after her husband left her for his assistant. He studied my expression. Does it bother you that I considered your personal history in my recommendation? I thought about this carefully. It would if that were the only reason. But it's not, is it? Not even close, Bill confirmed. I've been watching your career for years. Your work at Green Tech was revolutionary, and your consulting strategies for Meridian Power saved them from bankruptcy. You were the most qualified candidate by a significant margin. Your history with Patrick was simply fortuitous. I couldn't help but smile at his choice of words. There had been nothing fortuitous about the pain of Patrick's betrayal, the struggle of single motherhood, or the years of rebuilding my life from the ground up. But there was undeniable poetry in finding myself here now, positioned to hold him, accountable for both his personal and professional betrayals. I need to know, Bill, I said, leaning forward. How deep does this go? Who can I trust? He slid a flash drive across the desk. Everything I've gathered is here. Financial records, email correspondence, meeting notes. It's not enough for legal action yet, but it's a starting point. He paused. As for who you can trust, Carrie Mitchell in HR has been quietly documenting the personnel side of things. And there's a young engineer in renewables, Frank Carter, who's been fighting to keep his projects alive despite constant obstruction. I pocketed the flash drive. And the board? Divided, Bill said. 3 are compromised, 4 are oblivious. And 2, Eleanor Blackwood and James Morrison, suspected enough to support your appointment despite significant pushback. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Abigail entered, her expression tense. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation developing. Mr. Reynolds has called an emergency operations meeting and is telling the team that the restructuring has been temporarily paused pending board review. My jaw tightened. Not even 24 hours, and Patrick was already attempting to undermine my authority. It was exactly the kind of manipulative power play he'd specialized in during our marriage, creating confusion about decisions we'd made together, rewriting history to suit his narrative. Where is this meeting happening? I asked, rising from my chair. Conference room C, East Wing, Abigail replied. Bill raised an eyebrow. Planning to crash the party? I'm the CEO, I replied, gathering my tablet. It's not crashing if it's my company. Bill's expression showed a mixture of approval and concern. Just remember, Patrick knows how to provoke you. He'll try to make you look emotional, unstable. I smiled grimly, remembering how Patrick had weaponized my pregnancy hormones against me during arguments, dismissing valid concerns as emotional overreactions. Not anymore, I assured him. That Miranda is gone. The walk to conference room C gave me time to compose my strategy. This confrontation would set the tone for everything that followed. I needed to be authoritative without seeming vindictive, firm without appearing personal. The sweet satisfaction of revenge would come through results and exposure, not emotional outbursts. I could hear Patrick's voice through the door before I opened it. Confident, persuasive, with that familiar undertone of condescension he always used when explaining why his way was the only sensible approach. Simply a matter of timing, he was saying. The board agrees that such dramatic changes require more thorough analysis. Ms. Reynolds is new to our industry and doesn't fully understand. I pushed the door open, stepping into the sudden silence with measured confidence. 20 faces turned toward me, expressions ranging from surprise to discomfort to, in a few cases, poorly concealed satisfaction at Patrick's ambush being interrupted. Please don't let me interrupt, I said pleasantly, moving to the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair that should have been left vacant in the CEO's absence. I'm always eager to hear Mr. Reynolds's perspective on board decisions. Patrick's face flushed, though he quickly recovered. Miranda, we were just discussing implementation timelines for the restructuring. How interesting, I replied, setting my tablet on the table. Especially since I've just come from updating the board on the accelerated timeline. They're quite enthusiastic about the changes. It wasn't entirely true. I hadn't spoken with the board this morning, but neither was Patrick's claim of the restructuring being paused. I glanced around the table, noting who looked uncomfortable with my arrival and who seemed relieved. Since we're all here, this is an excellent opportunity to clarify the new reporting structure and priorities. Without waiting for permission, I connected my tablet to the room's display system. The organizational chart I'd presented yesterday appeared on the screen, with one significant addition: a detailed timeline for implementation, with today's date highlighted. As you can see, I continued smoothly, these changes are not pending review. They are in effect as of yesterday's board meeting. I turned to Patrick, my expression professionally neutral despite the satisfaction coursing through me. Mr. Reynolds, I believe you'll find your new office is ready. Abigail can show you where it's located after our meeting. The struggle played out visibly on Patrick's face, the impulse to challenge me publicly warring with the realization that doing so would only undermine his position further. It was the same expression he'd worn the day I'd refused to sign over, full ownership of our house during divorce negotiations, when he'd realized his usual intimidation tactics wouldn't work anymore. "Of course," he finally managed, his smile tight. "I must have misunderstood the timeline." An understandable confusion. "During periods of transition," I replied graciously, before turning my attention to the rest of the team. "Now, let's discuss the immediate priorities for operations under our new structure." As I outlined the action items and deadlines, I could feel Patrick seething beside me. The man who had once told me I'd never succeed without him was now watching me command the room he'd considered his exclusive territory. The man who had walked out on me and our unborn child was now experiencing a fraction of the powerlessness I'd felt that rainy night 7 years ago. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to balance the scales, but it was a beginning. And as I caught the flash of grudging respect in the eyes of several team members, I knew that the most satisfying revenge wouldn't be in humiliating Patrick, but in succeeding where he had failed, in building what he had tried to destroy, both at Horizon Energy and in my own life. The operations meeting concluded with Patrick making a hasty exit, muttering something about existing appointments. I remained in the conference room as the team filed out, many lingering to ask questions about the new structure, questions they'd clearly been afraid to raise under Patrick's leadership. When the last person left, I allowed myself a moment alone to absorb what had just happened. My hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline ebbed. I'd expected resistance from Patrick, but the brazenness of his attempt to undermine me had caught me off guard. It was all too reminiscent of our marriage: the gaslighting, the attempts to speak for me, the casual dismissal of my competence. My mind drifted back to the day we'd met, 8 years earlier. I'd been presenting my graduate research on renewable energy efficiency at an industry conference in Chicago. Patrick, already rising through the ranks at Atlas Energy, Horizon's main competitor at the time, had approached me afterward with that charming smile that would eventually become so familiar. "Impressive work," he'd said, his confidence immediately attractive to a nervous graduate student. "Though you might want to consider the practical implementation challenges. Theory doesn't always translate to the field." Even then, wrapped in a compliment, had been the subtle undermining that would become his hallmark. But I'd been too flattered by his attention to notice the red flag. Our whirlwind romance had progressed quickly. Dinner dates at expensive restaurants, weekend getaways to coastal towns, passionate conversations about the future of energy. Patrick had seemed so progressive then, so aligned with my vision of transforming the industry through innovation. I'd been completely taken in by his performance. 6 months later, we were married. I'd just completed my MBA and had multiple job offers, including one from Greentech Innovations, a promising renewable energy startup. "Take the Atlas offer instead," Patrick had urged, referring to the entry-level position his company had extended. "Sure, it pays less initially, but I'm on the inside. I can help your career advance much faster." I'd hesitated, torn between the exciting startup where I'd have more autonomy and the established company where my new husband worked. In the end, I'd chosen Greentech, my first real act of independence in our relationship. Patrick had been supportive outwardly, but something had shifted between us. Looking back, I realized that was the moment he began to see me as competition rather than a partner. The next 2 years had been a carefully choreographed dance. Patrick advancing at Atlas, me building Greentech's renewable portfolio from the ground up. On the surface, we were the perfect power couple, young and ambitious, frequently featured in industry publications as rising stars. Behind closed doors, the reality had been very different. Every success I achieved was met with subtle diminishment. "That's great, honey, though of course they're a smaller company with lower standards." Every setback became evidence of my limitations. "Maybe this is a sign you should consider a less demanding role, especially if we want to start a family soon." The baby had been unplanned, a surprise in the midst of the most challenging project of my career. I'd just been appointed lead strategist for GreenTech's expansion into international markets, a role that would require extensive travel and long hours. The timing couldn't have been worse. Patrick's reaction to the pregnancy news had seemed supportive at first. "This is perfect," he declared. "You've been working too hard anyway. Now you have a reason to step back." When I'd explained that I planned to continue with the project, his true feelings had emerged. "Be realistic, Miranda. You can't manage an international expansion while pregnant. No client will take you seriously once you start showing." The arguments had escalated over the following weeks. Each one ended the same way, with Patrick positioning himself as the voice of reason while painting me as emotional and unrealistic. His favorite phrase became a constant refrain: "You're not thinking clearly. The pregnancy hormones are affecting your judgment." I touched my temple, feeling the ghost of the headaches those arguments had triggered. Sitting in Horizon Energy's conference room surrounded by the trappings of corporate power, I could still hear the echo of Patrick's dismissive tone, still feel the growing isolation as he gradually convinced me that my ambitions were selfish, incompatible with motherhood. Breaking point had come during my 4th month of pregnancy. I'd successfully launched GreenTech's European division despite morning sickness and fatigue, proving that pregnancy hadn't diminished my capabilities. The company had thrown a celebration, and industry publications had covered the expansion favorably. I'd returned home that evening to find Patrick in our kitchen with Aileen, his young assistant. They'd sprung apart as I entered, but the intimacy between them had been unmistakable. "It's not what you think," he'd started, employing the most cliché denial possible. But it had been exactly what I thought, and worse. The subsequent confession had revealed not a momentary indiscretion, but a 6-month affair conducted largely in our home while I traveled for work. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he'd claimed. "But you've been so distant, so focused on your career instead of our marriage." Somehow in Patrick's narrative, my dedication to my work had justified his betrayal. Even more incredibly, he'd expected me to understand, to forgive him and focus on fixing our marriage by recommitting to traditional roles he'd always envisioned. Him as the breadwinner, me as the supportive wife and soon-to-be mother. The argument that followed had stripped away all pretense between us. Every resentment Patrick harbored about my success, every limitation he believed motherhood should impose on me, every doubt he'd planted about my abilities, all of it poured out in a torrent of revelations. "Face reality, Miranda," he'd finally snapped when I refused to accept his terms for reconciliation. "You're 4 months pregnant. No company will hire you in this condition. You need me far more than I need you." 3 days later, he'd moved out, leaving behind a check that he'd called generous financial support, and I'd recognized as a blatant attempt to control me through economic pressure. He'd taken Aileen with him, broadcasting their relationship publicly with a speed that suggested he'd been planning his exit for some time. The pregnancy had been difficult after that, stress compounding the physical challenges, isolation deepening, as mutual friends chose sides. Patrick had crafted a narrative that painted him as the victim of a career-obsessed wife who'd neglected their marriage. Many had believed him. I'd given birth to Lily with only Carrie by my side. Patrick had been noticeably absent, sending a generic bouquet with a card signed by his assistant. 2 weeks later, I'd received divorce papers with terms that would have left me financially dependent on him for years. My response had been to return to work with a newborn in tow, arranging a nursery in the corner of my office with my sympathetic CEO's blessing. I'd negotiated the divorce settlement with a ruthlessness that had surprised even my attorney, securing full custody of Lily and rejecting Patrick's support entirely. "You'll never succeed without me," he'd said during our final meeting, watching me struggle to balance paperwork and a fussing infant. "You're not cut out for this world, Miranda, not as a single mother." A knock on the conference room door pulled me from these memories. Abigail stood in the doorway, her expression concerned. "Ms. Reynolds, your next meeting starts in 5 minutes." I nodded, gathering my materials. "Thank you, Abigail. Also," she added hesitantly, "Mr. Reynolds asked me to give you this." She handed me a folded note. He was quite insistent. I unfolded the paper, recognizing Patrick's neat handwriting immediately. "Miranda, we need to talk privately. This hostile takeover of my department is unnecessary and unprofessional. I understand you may have personal grievances, but bringing them into the workplace only damages the company we both care about. Let's discuss a more reasonable transition over dinner tonight." Patrick, I couldn't help but laugh at his audacity, the familiar manipulation techniques, the attempt to position himself as the reasonable party, the implication that my decisions were emotional rather than strategic. The note could have been written 7 years ago. He still saw me through the same distorted lens. Abigail raised an eyebrow at my reaction. "Should I prepare a response?" I folded the note and tucked it into my pocket. "No response necessary," I replied. "Mr. Reynolds will receive my answer through actions rather than words." As I walked to my next meeting, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pain of the past couldn't be erased, but it had forged me into someone stronger than Patrick could ever comprehend. He still believed he was dealing with the woman he'd abandoned, uncertain, emotionally vulnerable, easy to manipulate. His failure to recognize how completely I'd transformed would be his undoing. And watching that realization dawn on him, day by day, would be the sweetest form of revenge. My next meeting was scheduled with the Renewable Innovation Team, the division that had suffered most under Patrick's leadership. I'd deliberately chosen to meet them in their workspace rather than summon them to the executive floor, wanting to see firsthand the conditions they'd been working in. The elevator took me down to the 3rd floor, a stark contrast to the polished marble and gleaming surfaces of the executive level. Here, the carpet was worn, the lighting fluorescent and harsh, the cubicles cramped and outdated. Even the air felt different, stale, with the faint metallic tang of overheated electronics, and too many people in too small a space. As I stepped off the elevator, conversations hushed and heads turned. News of my confrontation with Patrick had clearly traveled fast. I could feel the weight of evaluating gazes, some hopeful, others skeptical, all curious about the new CEO who had demoted their former boss. I followed Abigail through a maze of cubicles to a glass-walled conference room that had seen better days. The blinds were yellowed with age, several chairs mismatched, the presentation screen showing visible scratches. It was exactly the kind of subtle resource deprivation Patrick excelled at. Not obvious enough to trigger complaints, but persistent. Enough to undermine morale and productivity. Inside waited 5 people. The core innovation team that had somehow managed to keep developing renewable technologies despite systematic obstruction. I recognized Frank Carter immediately from his personnel file. Mid-30s, earnest expression behind wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of brilliant engineer who cared more about solving problems than office politics. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, rising, to shake my hand. "We're honored you wanted to meet with us directly." His tone carried a mixture of hope and wariness that spoke volumes about previous disappointments. "The honor is mine," I replied sincerely. "I've reviewed your team's work from the past 3 years. What you've managed to accomplish with limited resources is nothing short of remarkable." I saw surprise ripple across their faces, followed by cautious pleasure. When was the last time someone from the executive floor had actually acknowledged their efforts? For the next hour, I listened as they walked me through their current projects, challenges, and visions for the future. Their passion was palpable, their ideas innovative. What they lacked wasn't talent or drive, but the most basic resources: adequate funding, sufficient staff, and executive support. Our solar efficiency module could reduce installation costs by 32%, Frank explained, spreading blueprints across the table. We've been ready for prototype development for 18 months, but the funding keeps getting reallocated, I finished, to more pressing priorities in traditional energy operations. He nodded, relief washing over his features at being understood. Exactly. Every quarter, we submit the proposal. Every quarter, we get preliminary approval, and every quarter the funds mysteriously disappear before implementation. I studied the blueprints, noting the elegant simplicity of the design. This wasn't just a good idea. It was potentially revolutionary. Exactly the kind of innovation Patrick had been systematically burying. What would you need to have a working prototype within 3 months? I asked. Frank blinked, clearly caught off guard by the direct question. 3 months? With proper funding and staffing? He quickly calculated. About $2.3 million and freedom to pull in 6 additional engineers. I made a note on my tablet. Consider it done. I'll have Abigail work with you this afternoon to expedite the paperwork. The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly, skepticism giving way to stunned disbelief, then cautious excitement. These people had been fighting the same battles for so long that actual support from above seemed almost unreal. There's something else you should know, said Diana Hughes, an environmental systems engineer whose recommendations had been consistently overruled by Patrick. The efficiency data for our existing renewable installations has been deliberately misrepresented in quarterly reports. They're actually performing 24% better than officially documented. I wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still sent a chill through me. Let me guess. Someone wanted our renewable initiatives to appear less successful than they actually are? Diana nodded grimly. The real numbers would have justified major expansion of the program. Instead, Mr. Reynolds used the manipulated data to argue for maintaining our core business in traditional energy. Do you have documentation of the actual performance metrics? I asked. In response, Frank unlocked a drawer and pulled out a flash drive. We've been keeping parallel records for 2 years. Every test, every output measurement, all verified and time-stamped. He hesitated before handing it to me. This could cost people their jobs. Some people should lose their jobs, I replied, accepting the drive. Starting with those who betrayed this company's future for personal gain. As I left the renewable division an hour later, I could feel the shift in energy behind me, the spark of hope taking hold, the renewed sense of purpose. For years, these brilliant minds had been laboring under artificial constraints, their innovations systematically suppressed. Now they had a champion, and the atmosphere of resignation was giving way to possibility. The contrast to my next destination couldn't have been more striking. Patrick's operations department occupied the entire east wing of the 15th floor, spacious, recently renovated, with high-end furnishings and state-of-the-art technology. The message was clear in every detail. This was where the company's priorities, and money, had been directed. I paused in the doorway, observing the space before anyone noticed my presence. Executives occupied glass-walled offices along the perimeter, while their support staff worked in open-concept clusters at the center. The layout itself reinforced hierarchy and visibility. Those in power could observe everyone, while remaining partially sheltered themselves. So typically Patrick. The memory of our home office arrangement flashed through my mind. How he'd positioned my desk facing the wall while his commanded the room. At the time, he'd claimed it was to minimize my distractions. In retrospect, like so many of his actions, it had been about control and dominance. His new office was significantly smaller than his previous one, positioned among department managers rather than separated from them. Through the glass walls, I could see him engaged in intense conversation with Frank Wilson, the CFO. Neither had noticed me yet. I observed them for a moment, noting Patrick's agitated gestures, the tightness around his mouth that always appeared when things weren't going his way. Frank kept shaking his head, glancing nervously toward the entrance where I stood. Whatever Patrick was proposing, Frank wasn't comfortable with it. Eventually, Frank looked up and froze upon seeing me. Patrick, noticing his reaction, turned and locked eyes with me across the department floor. For a moment, neither of us moved. A silent acknowledgement of the changed power dynamic between us. I could have walked over, inserted myself into their conversation, demanded to know what they were discussing. The old Miranda might have done exactly that, eager to prove she belonged in their world of executive decisions. The new Miranda simply nodded coolly and continued her tour of the operations floor, letting them wonder what I'd seen and what I intended to do about it. The operations team watched me with undisguised curiosity as I moved among them, introducing myself, asking questions about their work. Many seemed surprised by my interest in their day-to-day activities, another indication of Patrick's leadership style. He had always been more concerned with results than process, with appearances than substance. Near the end of my visit, I paused. At the desk of Aileen Davis, Patrick's former assistant who had become his mistress and was now, according to her personnel file, a special projects coordinator in operations. A position created specifically for her, with a salary far exceeding the standard for her experience level. She looked up from her computer, recognition and shock washing over her face as she realized who I was. We had never officially met. Patrick had made sure of that, but she certainly knew who I was. The woman whose husband she'd taken, whose marriage she'd helped destroy, was now standing at her desk with the power to destroy her career. "Ms. Davis," I said pleasantly, "I'm Miranda Reynolds, the new CEO. I've been introducing myself to the team." She stammered a response, her face flushing. Yes, Ms. Reynolds. It's nice to meet you officially." The fear in her eyes was palpable, the awkwardness of our situation hanging heavily between us. 7 years ago, I'd fantasized about confronting her, screaming at her, making her feel a fraction of the pain and humiliation I'd experienced. Now, facing her in this context, I felt nothing but a cool detachment. "I've been reviewing the special projects portfolio," I continued, my tone professional. "I'd like a comprehensive report on your current initiatives by tomorrow morning, with measurable outcomes and ROI projections, please." The color drained from her face. We both knew there were no substantial projects to report on. Her position had been a convenient fiction created by Patrick to keep her close and well compensated. "Of course," she managed. "First thing tomorrow." I nodded and moved on, feeling her panicked gaze following me. Without looking back, I knew she would be reaching for her phone the moment I was out of sight, desperately texting Patrick about this unexpected confrontation. Let them worry. Let them scramble. The atmospheric pressure was shifting throughout, horizon energy, and everyone could feel it. From the renewed hope in the renewable division to the growing unease in operations. Like the calm before a storm, these subtle changes presaged the greater transformation to come, and I was only just beginning. That evening, I returned to my office to find Carrie waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. "I heard about your tour of the departments today," she said, handing me one of the cups. "Word travels fast, especially about the CEO personally approving a multi-million-dollar prototype that Patrick has been blocking for over a year." I smiled, taking a sip of the much-needed caffeine. "Good. I want the message to spread. Things are changing at Horizon, and everyone needs to understand that." "Patrick is already rallying his allies," Carrie warned. "He's called Frank Wilson, Harold Thompson from Legal, and James Peterson from the board. They had drinks at the Capitol Grill after work." "I expected as much," I replied, settling behind my desk. Patrick has never been one to accept defeat. Graciously, Carrie studied me carefully. "You don't seem concerned." "Because I've been preparing for this moment longer than he realizes," I said, unlocking my desk drawer. I pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it, revealing a meticulously organized collection of documents. This is what I've been working on for the past 2 months, ever since Bill approached me about taking over as CEO. Carrie moved closer, eyes widening as she scanned the contents. Miranda, this is a comprehensive restructuring plan, I finished. Detailed financial projections for expanding our renewable portfolio. Performance metrics from competitors who've already made the transition. Legal frameworks for the changes I'm implementing. And contingency plans for every form of resistance I anticipated. The portfolio represented hundreds of hours of work, late nights after Lily was asleep, weekends spent analyzing industry data, consultations with experts in corporate law and renewable energy. While Patrick had been comfortably ensconced in his executive position, believing himself untouchable, I had been methodically preparing his downfall. I've also been building my support network, I continued, flipping to a section that detailed key allies within Horizon and throughout the industry. Eleanor Blackwood and James Morrison from the board are firmly behind the renewable pivot. They've been quietly dissatisfied with our lagging performance compared to competitors. Carrie shook her head, impressed. You're 3 steps ahead of them already. I have to be, I replied. Patrick underestimated me once before, and it cost me dearly. This time the consequences will be his to bear. I reached for my phone as it buzzed with an incoming email. That should be the preliminary audit report I commissioned from Deloitte. I had them begin reviewing our financial records the moment I accepted the position. The email confirmed my suspicions. Significant discrepancies in how renewable projects had been budgeted versus how funds had actually been deployed. Not enough evidence for criminal charges yet, but certainly enough to justify a more thorough investigation. I've also scheduled meetings with our 5 largest investors for next week, I added, forwarding the audit report to Carrie. They've been promised returns on renewable investments that haven't materialized. When they understand why and who's responsible, Patrick will find his support rapidly evaporating. Carrie looked at me with newfound appreciation. This isn't just about revenge for you, is it? You genuinely want to transform Horizon. The two aren't mutually exclusive, I replied. The best revenge isn't just about making Patrick suffer, it's about succeeding where he failed, building what he tried to destroy. I closed the portfolio. And yes, I want to see the look on his face when he realizes that the woman he abandoned is the one who finally unleashed Horizon's potential. My phone buzzed again, a text from my neighbor who was watching Lily. She's asking when you'll be home. Says she wants to show you her science project. Speaking of priorities, I said, showing Carrie the message. The most important part of my life is waiting for me at home. As I gathered my things, Carrie helped me organize the documents. For tomorrow's executive committee meeting, the first major presentation of my vision for Horizon's future. Patrick will try to derail it, she warned. He's already working on a counter-proposal that maintains traditional energy as our primary focus. Let him try, I replied confidently. I've anticipated his arguments and prepared responses for each one. More importantly, I have data he can't refute and board support he doesn't know about yet. Before leaving, I paused at the window overlooking the city. Lights twinkled in office buildings and apartments, thousands of homes using energy that companies like Horizon provided. For too long, Patrick's short-sighted leadership had kept us tethered to outdated technologies and business models, prioritizing quick profits over sustainable growth. You know, I said thoughtfully. When Patrick left me, he said I'd never succeed. Without him, that I wasn't cut out for balancing ambition and motherhood. I turned to Carrie. What he never understood was that becoming Lily's mother didn't diminish my capabilities. It enhanced them. I learned to be more efficient, more focused, more determined. And now you're using those same skills to run his company better than he ever could, Carrie observed with a smile. Our company, I corrected. And yes, the irony isn't lost on me. The drive home gave me time to transition from CEO back to mom, a balancing act I'd perfected over the years. As I pulled into our modest suburban neighborhood, I reflected on how different my life was from what Patrick had envisioned for us. He'd wanted the mansion in the exclusive gated community, the status symbols, the power couple's lifestyle. I'd chosen this instead, a comfortable home in a good school district, financial security without ostentation, and a life centered around Lily's well-being rather than appearances. Lily was waiting at the door when I arrived, bouncing with excitement about her volcano science project. As I helped her put the finishing touches on the papier-mâché mountain, listening to her detailed explanation of how the chemical reaction would work, I felt a profound gratitude for how things had turned out. Patrick's betrayal had freed me to build a life on my own terms, a life he couldn't diminish or control. Now, as CEO of Horizon Energy, I would do the same for the company. Free it from his self-serving leadership and transform it into something stronger and more valuable than he could have envisioned. Harold blinked, clearly not expecting such thorough preparation. He rifled through the packet, frowning as he scanned the legal analysis. Additionally, I continued, the regulatory landscape is shifting rapidly in favor of renewable development. The tax incentives alone make this transition financially advantageous, quite apart from the market positioning benefits. Patrick had remained silent during this exchange, studying me with growing calculation. He recognized the strategy now. I was systematically dismantling the obstacles he'd planned to raise, anticipating each one before it could gain traction. The financial models are certainly compelling in theory, he finally said, his voice carrying that familiar patronizing tone he'd always used when explaining why my ideas weren't practical. But theory rarely accounts for real-world implementation challenges. The renewable division simply doesn't have the operational infrastructure to scale at the pace you're suggesting. An excellent transition to our next topic, I replied, refusing to be baited. Let's discuss why the renewable division's infrastructure has remained underdeveloped despite repeated budget approvals for expansion. I pulled up the financial tracking data Frank Carter had provided, the parallel records showing how funds allocated to renewable development had been consistently diverted. The room grew uncomfortably quiet as the pattern became undeniable. As you can see, I continued into the silence, over $86 million allocated to renewable infrastructure development over the past 3 years has been redirected to other initiatives, primarily within traditional energy operations. This wasn't merely a question of insufficient resources. It was a systematic reallocation of approved funding. Patrick's face hardened. Those funds were strategically redeployed to address more immediate operational priorities. That's standard practice in any large corporation. Resources flow where they're most needed. Except that these redeployments directly contradicted board-approved strategic initiatives, I countered. More concerning is that the performance reports to the board never reflected these reallocations transparently. The renewable division was effectively set up to fail through resource starvation, while being held accountable for missing targets. Eleanor Blackwood, who had been listening intently, spoke for the first time. Are you suggesting deliberate sabotage of board directives, Ms. Reynolds? The question hung in the air, creating exactly the opening I needed. I'm presenting data, Ms. Blackwood. The pattern speaks for itself. I paused, letting the implication settle. What's clear is that our renewable division has been systematically disadvantaged despite its strategic importance to our future. My proposal addresses this historical imbalance and creates accountability measures to ensure it doesn't continue. Patrick leaned forward, his expression darkening. This presentation feels less like strategic planning and more like an indictment of previous management. I have to question whether personal history is influencing professional judgment here. And there it was, the personal attack I'd been waiting for, the attempt to paint me as emotionally motivated rather than data-driven. 7 years ago, this tactic had been devastatingly effective, making me question my own perceptions and capabilities. Now it simply confirmed how predictable he remained. I understand why it might feel that way to you, Patrick, I replied calmly. When data contradicts our preferred narrative, it often feels personal. But these financial records aren't emotional, they're factual. And the facts indicate a persistent pattern of decisions that have disadvantaged our company's future prospects. Eleanor. Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly as she observed our exchange. The room had grown tense, the professional veneer wearing thin as the real power struggle emerged into view. Perhaps, she suggested, we should take a 15-minute break before continuing. This discussion clearly requires everyone's full attention. As the executives filed out, Patrick remained seated, his expression unreadable. When the room had emptied except for us, he finally spoke. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "Not a question, but a realization." "I learned from the best," I replied. "You always emphasize the importance of thorough preparation." He laughed humorlessly. "Is this really how you want to play it, Miranda? Turning a corporate strategy meeting into a personal vendetta?" "That's the fundamental difference between us, Patrick," I said, gathering my materials. "You see this as a game being played. I see it as a company being led." I met his gaze directly. "The fact that dismantling your destructive leadership brings me personal satisfaction is merely a bonus." As I walked toward the door, he called after me. "You won't win this. Not everyone is fooled by your polished presentation and convenient data." I paused, turning back with a smile. "Then I suggest you use this break to prepare your counter-arguments. You'll need them to be substantially more compelling than they've been so far." Stepping into the hallway, I felt a rush of satisfaction. The opposition had revealed itself exactly as expected, and I had met each challenge with methodical preparation. Patrick was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he was facing someone who knew all his tactics and had developed effective countermeasures for each one. The real battle was just beginning, but the opening skirmish had gone decisively in my favor. During the break, I stepped into a quiet corner of the executive floor to collect my thoughts. The confrontation with Patrick had gone as expected, but managing the emotional undercurrent while maintaining professional composure was exhausting. 7 years had passed, yet his dismissive tone still had the power to trigger memories I'd rather forget. My mind drifted back to what I now recognized as the true breaking point in our relationship, not the discovery of his affair, but an incident. 3 weeks earlier, it had been the moment that fundamentally changed how I saw myself and my marriage, though I hadn't fully realized it at the time. I'd been 6 months pregnant, leading a crucial presentation to potential European investors for green tech. After weeks of preparation, navigating morning sickness and fatigue, I'd secured a commitment for $30 million in funding, a career-defining achievement that had made headlines in industry publications. That evening, we'd planned a celebration. Dinner. I'd arrived home to find Patrick in our living room, drinking scotch and reviewing documents, his expression stormy. "Congratulations on the funding," he'd said, not looking up from his papers. Though I hear James Mitchell did most of the heavy lifting. James had been a junior member of my team, someone I'd mentored. The suggestion that he deserved credit for my achievement had been a calculated diminishment. James gave the technical overview, I'd corrected, trying to keep my tone light despite my growing irritation. I led the strategic presentation and final negotiations. Patrick had finally looked up, his expression one of practiced concern. "Don't misunderstand, honey. It's impressive what you accomplished, especially in your condition. I just think it's important to acknowledge everyone's contributions." His condescension had been palpable, couched in supportive language but designed to undermine. It was a familiar pattern, one I'd accepted for too long. My condition, repeated, something shifting inside me. "You mean my pregnancy? The pregnancy you assured me wouldn't impact how I was viewed professionally?" "Don't be so sensitive," he'd replied dismissively. "I'm trying to help you. The industry talks, Miranda. People notice when a pregnant executive takes credit for her team's work." "Takes credit?" The phrase had hit me like a physical blow. I built that presentation from the ground up. I brought in those investors. I closed that deal. He'd sighed, with exaggerated patience. And you have a tendency to overstate your contributions. It's not attractive, Miranda, especially now. His gaze had deliberately shifted to my pregnant belly. You should be focusing on preparing for the baby, not competing for accolades. Something had broken inside me in that moment. A fundamental trust that despite our differences, Patrick respected me and my achievements. The realization that he actively sought to diminish me, to rewrite my successes as either exaggerated or dependent on others, had shaken the foundation of how I understood our relationship. What exactly are you afraid of, Patrick? I'd asked quietly. That I might be more successful than you? That pregnancy hasn't diminished my capabilities the way you clearly hoped it would? His expression had hardened. That's absurd. I'm trying to help you maintain perspective during a vulnerable time. Pregnancy hormones are affecting your judgment, making you paranoid and overly emotional. It was the first time I'd clearly seen the manipulation for what it was. Not concern, but control. Not support, but sabotage. And as I'd stood there, feeling my baby kick as if in solidarity, I'd made a silent promise to myself and my child. I would never again allow anyone, especially Patrick, to define my worth or capabilities. 3 weeks later, when I discovered his affair with Aileen, it had been painful, but almost anticlimactic, the final confirmation of what I already knew in my heart. Our marriage had been built on Patrick's need to be superior, to be the gatekeeper of my success. When my achievements threatened that dynamic, he'd found someone who made him feel powerful again. A gentle knock pulled me from these memories. Carrie stood in the doorway, concern evident in her expression. They're heading back to the boardroom, she said. Are you okay? I took a deep breath, centering myself. I'm fine. Just remembering why we're here. Patrick's been huddled with Frank and Harold the entire break, she warned. They're planning something. Let them, I replied, gathering my materials. It won't change the outcome. When I returned to the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted, perceptibly. Patrick sat with renewed confidence, a folder open before him that hadn't been there earlier. Frank Wilson wore a smug expression that immediately put me on alert, while Harold Thompson was uncharacteristically animated in conversation with another executive. Eleanor Blackwood caught my eye as I took my seat, her slight frown conveying concern about whatever had developed during the break. Let's resume, I said, reclaiming control of the meeting. Before the break, we were discussing the historical reallocation of funds away from board-approved renewable initiatives. Now I'd like to present our path forward. Patrick cleared his throat. Actually, Miranda, in light of your allegations about financial mismanagement, I think it's important to address some broader concerns about fiscal responsibility and decision-making. He slid documents across the table, copies for everyone present. These are the preliminary findings from an internal audit conducted by Finance last month, focused specifically on the consulting arrangements made during the transition period between Bill Hargrove's announcement of retirement and your appointment as CEO. I maintained my composure while quickly scanning the document. It highlighted several consulting contracts I'd initiated to assess Horizon's renewable potential, painting them as wasteful expenditures without proper authorization. The numbers had been selectively presented to suggest impropriety where none existed. Interesting timing for this audit to suddenly appear, I observed, my tone even. Especially since all consulting arrangements were approved through proper channels and fully documented. The timing is relevant only because your presentation today raises questions about fiscal oversight, Patrick countered smoothly. If we're going to discuss financial stewardship, we should ensure our own house is in order first. It was a calculated move, shifting focus from his years of mismanagement to my 2 months of preparation, creating doubt about my credibility at a crucial moment. Classic Patrick. When confronted with evidence of his wrongdoing, he would immediately counter-accuse, forcing his opponent into a defensive position. 7 years ago, this tactic would have worked. I would have become flustered, defensive, desperate to prove my innocence while the original issue, his misconduct, faded into the background. Not today. I appreciate your concern for proper oversight, I said calmly. These consulting arrangements were indeed substantial investments, necessary ones to properly evaluate Horizon's position in the renewable landscape after years of inconsistent data. I turned to Frank Wilson. Frank, as CFO, you personally, signed off on these expenditures on May 15th. Do you recall raising any concerns at that time about their appropriateness? Frank shifted uncomfortably. I may have signed the approvals without fully reviewing the details. That seems unlikely, I replied, opening my portfolio to extract a printed email, especially given your detailed questions about the scope of work and your subsequent approval after receiving clarification. I placed the email on the table. You specifically noted the strategic value of these assessments in preparation for new leadership. The room grew quiet as Frank stared at the email, his earlier smugness evaporating. I turned back to address the entire room. Let's be clear about what's happening here. We're witnessing an attempt to distract from the substantive issues raised in my presentation by casting doubt on my fiscal responsibility. It's a technique I've encountered before. My gaze met Patrick's directly. The difference is that I anticipated it this time and came prepared with complete documentation for every decision I've made. Eleanor Blackwood leaned forward. Mr. Reynolds, is there substance to these allegations of impropriety beyond questioning the timing of approved expenditures? Patrick's jaw tightened. The pattern of spending suggests a predetermined agenda rather than objective analysis. A predetermined agenda, I repeated thoughtfully. Like systematically redirecting funds from renewable initiatives despite board directives to the contrary? That kind of predetermined agenda? The tension in the room was palpable. Patrick had overplayed his hand, making an accusation he couldn't substantiate while unintentionally reinforcing my points about his own conduct. I suggest we return to Ms. Reynolds's presentation, Eleanor said firmly. These side issues can be addressed in the appropriate forum if there are genuine concerns. As I resumed my presentation, outlining the clear path forward for Horizon's renewable transformation, I caught Patrick's gaze briefly. For the first time, I saw something new in his expression. Genuine uncertainty. He had deployed his most reliable tactic, the one that had always worked in the past, and watched it fail completely. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Patrick was now fighting on my terrain, against an opponent who knew all his strategies, and had developed effective countermeasures for each one. The critical flashpoint had come and gone. And this time, I had emerged stronger. The executive committee meeting concluded with a clear mandate. The renewable transformation would proceed as I had outlined. Despite Patrick's attempts to derail the discussion, the data had spoken persuasively. Even his strongest allies had been forced to acknowledge the compelling business case for change. As the executives filed out, Eleanor Blackwood remained behind, her expression thoughtful. That was quite the performance, she said once we were alone. Both yours and Patrick's. I gathered my materials, keeping my expression neutral. I presented facts, Eleanor. Patrick presented objections. That's how these discussions typically work. She smiled slightly. We both know there was nothing typical about that meeting. She paused, studying me. The board meets on Friday to review the quarterly performance. I assume you'll be presenting this strategic shift? Yes, I confirmed, along with the preliminary findings from the financial audit. Eleanor nodded slowly. 3 days isn't much time for Patrick and his allies to mount an effective opposition. Was that deliberate timing on your part? I believe in moving efficiently once decisions are made, I replied carefully. especially when delay has already cost the company significantly. She seemed satisfied with this diplomatic answer. Well, it should be an interesting board meeting. I look forward to it. After Eleanor left, I checked my watch. 2:15 p.m., just 45 minutes until my next critical appointment. I'd deliberately scheduled it for today, knowing that timing was essential to maintaining momentum. Abigail appeared in the doorway. The Reuters reporter will be here at 3 hours as scheduled. Also, Mr. Reynolds has called an emergency meeting with his operations team for 4:30. Thank you, Abigail. Has the press release been finalized? She handed me a folder. Legal approved. The final version this morning. It focuses entirely on the strategic shift to renewables, with quotes from you and Eleanor Blackwood. No mention of the financial discrepancies. Perfect, I replied, scanning the document. The press release was carefully crafted to announce Horizon Energy's accelerated commitment to renewable technologies, highlighting the substantial new investment and leadership vision driving the change. While it never mentioned the previous mismanagement directly, industry insiders would immediately recognize the implicit criticism of past leadership. Once the story broke, Patrick would find himself fighting a public narrative as well as an internal one. The clock was ticking on his ability to control the situation. I glanced at the calendar on my desk, where Friday's board meeting was highlighted. 3 days to prepare the comprehensive presentation that would not only secure board approval for my vision but potentially end Patrick's career at Horizon Energy. The timeline was tight but deliberate, giving my opponents enough time to recognize the threat, but not enough to effectively counter it. My phone buzzed with a text from Carrie. Frank Wilson requesting urgent meeting with you. Says it's about the audit. I smiled slightly. Right on schedule. Frank was looking for a way to distance himself from Patrick before the board meeting. Tell him I can see him tomorrow morning at 7:30, I replied. The pieces were falling into place according to the timeline I'd mapped out. By Friday's board meeting, Patrick would be isolated, his support eroded, his options limited. 7 years ago, he'd walked away from our marriage on his terms, controlling the narrative and the timing. Now I was controlling both, methodically, dismantling the power structure he'd built. At precisely 3 p.m., Abigail escorted Sarah Mercer, the Reuters energy sector correspondent, into my office. Sarah was known for her sharp analysis and industry influence, exactly the right person to break this story. Ms. Reynolds, she greeted me. Congratulations on the CEO position. Quite a bold move by Horizon's board, bringing in an outsider with your renewable energy expertise. Horizon recognized the need for transformation, I replied, gesturing for her to take a seat. The energy landscape is changing rapidly, and companies must adapt or risk obsolescence. And Patrick Reynolds? She asked with the directness journalists are known for. I understand he was passed over for the CEO position despite his long tenure at Horizon. Any tension there? The question was a perfect opening, but I maintained professional restraint. Mr. Reynolds has been a valuable member of the operations team. In our new structure, we're realigning all departments to better support our renewable focus. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the careful phrasing. Realigning sounds like a significant change. Is that what today's announcement is about? Partly, I acknowledged, handing her the press release. Horizon Energy is announcing a fundamental strategic shift with a $2.8 billion investment in renewable technology development over the next 3 years. Sarah quickly scanned the document, her expression sharpening. $2.8 billion is massive, nearly triple your previous renewable commitment. The market will see this as a complete reversal of Horizon's traditional energy-first approach. Not a reversal, I corrected. An acceleration of what should have been happening all along. Horizon's board has long supported renewable development. In principle, we're simply aligning our actual investments with our stated priorities. The interview continued for 30 minutes, with Sarah probing for details about implementation timelines, market positioning, and leadership changes. I provided clear, confident responses while carefully avoiding any direct criticism of Patrick or previous management. I didn't need to criticize explicitly. The numbers spoke for themselves, and Sarah was skilled enough to read between the lines. By the time she left, I knew tomorrow's headline would create exactly the external pressure I needed before Friday's board meeting. Checking my watch again, 3:45 p.m. Patrick's emergency operations meeting would begin in 45 minutes, a desperate attempt to consolidate his remaining support and develop a counter-strategy. By now, he would have heard about my interview with Reuters and realized its implications. My phone buzzed with an email notification from Bill Hargrove. Just got a call from Peterson on the board. Patrick's been reaching out to directors individually, claiming the renewable pivot is financially reckless and driven by personal vendetta. 3 seem receptive. May need to accelerate our timeline. I frowned slightly. Patrick was moving faster than anticipated, trying to build board opposition before Friday's meeting. Time to adjust my own schedule accordingly. I called Abigail in. I need to move up the investor calls to tomorrow morning before the Reuters piece goes live, and schedule a dinner with James Morrison from the board for tonight if he's available. Already? On it, she replied efficiently. Also, the preliminary audit report has been completed. The findings are significant. Send it directly to my secure email, I instructed. And ask Eleanor if she can review it before tomorrow's executive committee follow-up. The clock on my wall seemed to tick louder as the pieces moved more rapidly across this corporate chessboard. Friday's board meeting was the ultimate deadline, the moment when all these carefully orchestrated elements would converge, either securing my vision for Horizon's future or giving Patrick an opening to undermine it. For 7 years, I had rebuilt my life methodically, patiently, turning Patrick's betrayal into motivation rather than defeat. Now, with less than 72 hours until the board meeting that would decide both our professional fates, that same methodical patience was being tested by the accelerating timeline. Patrick had never been good at waiting, at allowing situations to develop strategically. His emergency meeting, his rushed calls to board members, all reflected his tendency to react rather than plan. It was a weakness I could exploit. Because while Patrick scrambled to salvage his position in the hours and days ahead, I had been preparing for this moment for years. The countdown to Friday wasn't a threat to my strategy. It was the culmination of it. Late that evening, after a productive dinner with James Morrison that had secured another firm board ally, I returned to the office to review the preliminary audit findings. The Horizon Energy building was mostly empty, the executive floor eerily quiet except for the low hum of air conditioning and the occasional distant sound of the cleaning staff. The audit report confirmed what I'd suspected. The financial manipulation went far beyond simple fund reallocation. Patrick and Frank had established an elaborate system for suppressing renewable division performance while artificially inflating traditional energy returns. The pattern was damning when viewed comprehensively, revealing years of deliberate misrepresentation to both the board and shareholders. I was so absorbed in the documents that I didn't hear the office door open. Patrick's voice startled me. "Working late, Miranda? Some things never change." I looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, jacket draped over his arm. The familiar condescension in his tone was tempered by something new, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Patrick," I acknowledged, closing the audit file on my tablet. "Did you need something?" He stepped into the office uninvited, closing the door behind him. "Just a conversation. Off the record, no witnesses, just you and me." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Despite the late hour and obvious stress, he still maintained the polished appearance that had once impressed me. The tailored shirt, the expensive watch, the carefully controlled body language. But the facade was showing cracks, the slight tension around his eyes, the too tight grip on his jacket. "I wasn't aware we had anything to discuss privately," I replied. Don't do this, Miranda. His tone shifted, becoming almost conciliatory. This vendetta, and yes, that's exactly what it is, doesn't just harm me. It damages Horizon. It damages the industry relationships I've built over a decade. Interesting that you interpret evidence-based strategic decisions as a personal vendetta, I observed. That says more about your perspective than mine. He sighed, dropping the friendly pretense. Cut the corporate speak. We both know what this is about. I left you, and now you're using your position to punish me. It's unprofessional and beneath the woman I thought you were. The sheer audacity of his statement was breathtaking. 7 years ago, his dismissive reduction of my motivations would have triggered defensive justifications. Now it simply confirmed how little he'd evolved. The woman you thought I was, I repeated calmly. That's precisely the issue, Patrick. You never saw me clearly. Not during our marriage, not when you walked out, and certainly not now. He moved closer, perching on the edge of my desk in a deliberate invasion of space. Another familiar tactic designed to establish dominance. Saw a talented analyst with potential, he countered. I supported your career until you became obsessed with proving yourself at the expense of our marriage. Supported? I couldn't help but laugh. You undermined me at every opportunity. You took credit for my ideas, dismissed my achievements, and used my pregnancy as a weapon to limit my ambitions. That's an extremely revisionist view of our relationship, he said, his expression hardening. But even if that were true, bringing our personal history into Horizon's leadership is reckless. This company isn't a prop in your revenge fantasy. Amos stood, reclaiming the physical dynamic. You know what's truly fascinating, Patrick? Your absolute certainty that my actions must revolve around you. The possibility that I might be making decisions based on business merit rather than personal history simply doesn't compute in your worldview. The Reuters interview? He challenged. The strategic leak about the audit? The systematic dismantling of the operations structure I built? Those are merit-based decisions? Every single one, I confirmed. The renewable pivot is 15 years overdue and financially essential for Horizon's survival. The operations restructuring addresses inefficiencies that have cost shareholders millions. The audit simply reveals financial misrepresentations that should have been addressed years ago. And the fact that these changes specifically target my position and influence is just coincidental? His tone was incredulous. Not coincidental at all, I replied evenly. Your position and influence have been the primary obstacles to necessary change. The correlation isn't personal, it's causal. He stood abruptly, frustration breaking through his controlled facade. This self-righteous act might impress the board, but I know you, Miranda. I remember how desperately you wanted to prove yourself, how personally you took every professional setback. You knew the woman I was 7 years ago, I corrected. A woman who still believed in your support, who hadn't yet recognized the pattern of sabotage disguised as concern. Patrick's expression shifted, a calculating look replacing the frustration. I've spoken with 3 board members who share my concerns about the pace and scale of your proposed changes. By Friday, I'll have a majority. Is that why you're here? I asked. A courtesy warning before your attempted coup? I'm here to offer a compromise, he said, his tone softening artificially. A more moderate approach to renewable integration, one that doesn't throw away decades of successful traditional energy operations. We announce it jointly, present a united front to the board. Everyone wins. I studied him, recognizing the familiar negotiating tactic. Create fear of a worse outcome, then offer a reasonable alternative that still achieves his objectives. That's generous of you, I replied. Particularly since the preliminary audit findings would justify your immediate suspension pending further investigation. The color drained slightly from his face. What findings? The systematic misrepresentation of renewable division performance. The creative reallocation of board-approved funds, the adjusted projections submitted to shareholders. I maintained eye contact as I delivered each point. The audit team has been quite thorough. Patrick's expression hardened. Financial management, in a complex corporation, involves judgment calls and strategic decisions that might look questionable when viewed in isolation. These weren't isolated incidents, I countered. They form a clear pattern of deliberate misrepresentation spanning years. The board will find it difficult to ignore. He moved toward the door, his earlier conciliatory approach abandoned. This isn't over, Miranda. I built Horizon's operations division from the ground up. My relationships in this industry go deeper than you can imagine. And yet, I replied calmly, here we are. You fighting to preserve the status quo while I lead the company into its future. He paused at the door, turning back with a cold smile. You always did overestimate your capabilities. That hasn't changed. No, Patrick, I said as he reached for the handle. What hasn't changed is your fundamental inability to recognize my capabilities. The difference is that now it's your weakness, not mine. The door closed behind him with a decisive click, leaving me alone in the quiet office. The confrontation had unfolded almost exactly as I'd anticipated. Patrick's initial condescension, the attempt at manipulation, the resort to threats when those failed, and finally, the personal attack meant to undermine my confidence. 7 years ago, his tactics would have left me questioning myself, wondering if I was indeed overreaching or acting from emotional motivation. Tonight, they simply confirmed the righteousness of my course. Patrick remained the same man who had walked out on me and our unborn child, unable to conceive of a woman whose ambitions and abilities might exceed his own. Friday's board meeting now loomed with even greater significance. Patrick would indeed be marshalling his allies, making his case against my leadership. The confrontation had clarified the stakes beyond any doubt. This was no longer just about transforming Horizon Energy, but about definitively proving Patrick wrong about me, about what I was capable of achieving without him, and I was more than ready for that challenge. Friday morning arrived with a sense of inevitable confrontation. The previous 2 days had been a whirlwind of preparation, investor calls, strategy sessions, audit review meetings, and careful coalition building with board members. The Reuters article had created precisely the external pressure I'd anticipated, with industry analysts praising Horizon's belated but bold pivot to renewable leadership. Patrick had been equally busy, according to Carey's intelligence network. He'd held multiple closed-door meetings with his remaining allies, made countless calls to industry contacts, and even reached out to 2 major shareholders with whom he had personal relationships. As I dressed for the board meeting, I chose my outfit deliberately. A navy power suit similar to the one I'd worn on my first day as CEO, but with one significant addition. Around my neck hung a delicate silver pendant Lily had given me for Mother's Day last year, inscribed with "Mom, my superhero." It wasn't a typical accessory for a corporate boardroom, but today I wanted that reminder close to my heart. The Horizon Energy boardroom was tense when I arrived 30 minutes early. I had requested a specific seating arrangement, placing the audit team representatives directly to my right, with their comprehensive findings in neat folders before each board member's place. By 8:55, the board members had begun to arrive, 13 men and women who collectively controlled Horizon's fate. I greeted each one personally, noting who made eye contact and who seemed to avoid it. Eleanor Blackwood and James Morrison, my strongest allies, positioned themselves strategically across the table from Frank Wilson and Howard Peterson, Patrick's most vocal supporters. Patrick entered at precisely 9 NUC, looking confident despite the pressure of the past few days. He nodded cordially to several board members, his expression revealing nothing of our confrontation 2 nights earlier. As the last to arrive, he found himself seated at the far end of the table, a deliberate arrangement that subtly reinforced his diminished position. "Good morning, everyone," I began once the room had settled. Today's agenda includes several critical items, but I'd like to start with the most significant: the comprehensive audit of Horizon Energy's financial reporting and resource allocation over the past 5 years. Patrick's expression flickered briefly before returning to careful neutrality. He hadn't expected the audit to lead the agenda, a strategic decision I'd made just yesterday to prevent him from controlling the initial narrative. As you can see from the reports before you, I continued, the audit team has identified systematic discrepancies between approved allocations and actual fund deployment, particularly regarding our renewable energy initiatives. I nodded to Jessica Chen, the lead auditor, who stood to present the findings in detailed, dispassionate terms. As she walked the board through the evidence of financial manipulation, I watched the members' reactions. Shock gave way to concern, then to anger as the full picture emerged. In summary, Jessica concluded, approximately $243 million allocated to renewable development over the past 5 years was redirected to other initiatives without proper board notification or approval. These reallocations were obscured through fragmented reporting and selective data presentation. The silence that followed was deafening. Board Chairman William Harper, who had remained neutral throughout the leadership transition, finally spoke. "This is extremely concerning," he said, his tone measured but grave. "Mr. Reynolds, as the executive directly responsible for these operational areas during the period in question, do you have a response to these findings?" All eyes turned to Patrick, who maintained remarkable composure despite the damning evidence before him. "Chairman Harper, board members," he began confidently, "what you're seeing is a reinterpretation of standard resource allocation practices. In a complex organization like Horizon, funds must be deployed flexibly to address emerging priorities. Everything done was within my authority as Operations VP and aligned with our overall corporate objectives. It was a masterful deflection, acknowledging the actions while reframing them as normal business practice rather than deliberate misrepresentation. 7 years in corporate leadership had honed Patrick's ability to navigate troubled waters. "If I may," I interjected, "the audit findings specifically highlight that these reallocations systematically disadvantaged one division, renewables, while benefiting traditional energy operations, despite board directives to prioritize renewable development. This wasn't flexible resource management. It was deliberate circumvention of board-approved strategy." Patrick's eyes narrowed slightly. "That characterization reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of operational realities, Ms. Reynolds. Resources were allocated based on actual performance metrics and return potential, not arbitrary preferences." "An interesting perspective," I replied, opening a folder of my own. "Particularly given these performance projections prepared by the Renewable Division, but never presented to the board." I distributed copies of the documents Frank Carter had provided, the parallel records showing the actual performance of renewable initiatives versus what had been reported to the board. "These records," I explained, "show that our renewable projects were consistently outperforming the figures presented in quarterly reports by an average of 22%. The performance metrics used to justify resource reallocation were themselves manipulated." The revelation landed like a bombshell. Even Patrick's strongest supporters on the board looked disturbed by this new evidence. William Harper removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose as he absorbed the implications. "Mr. Reynolds," he said finally, "are you saying these alternative performance records are fabricated?" Patrick hesitated, visibly calculating his response. "I'm saying I've never seen these particular documents before. They don't align with the official reporting channels established by finance." "They don't align because they weren't allowed to," I explained. "The renewable team maintained these parallel records precisely because their actual results were being consistently misrepresented in official reports." Eleanor Blackwood leaned forward. "Are you suggesting deliberate suppression of positive results, Mr. Reynolds? Because that would constitute serious misconduct, possibly rising to the level of shareholder fraud." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. What had begun as a strategic debate about Horizon's future direction had transformed into something far more serious. An investigation into potential corporate malfeasance. Patrick's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. You're all being manipulated by a CEO with a personal vendetta. Miranda and I have a history that's clearly influencing her judgment and interpretation of normal business decisions." There, it was, the desperate personal attack I'd anticipated. But instead of undermining my position, his outburst only highlighted his own loss of control. William Harper raised an eyebrow. "A history? Would you care to elaborate on that, Mr. Reynolds?" Patrick looked around the table, suddenly realizing he'd stepped onto dangerous ground. Most of the board members were watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. "Ms. Reynolds and I were previously acquainted," he said stiffly. "Our personal history is creating a bias in how she's interpreting these business decisions." "Previously acquainted," I repeated softly. "An interesting euphemism for married for 3 years until he left me while I was 6 months pregnant with our daughter." The revelation echoed in the sudden silence of the boardroom. Several board members who hadn't known this detail looked stunned. Even those who had heard rumors seemed shocked by the direct confirmation. The moment of truth had arrived, transforming everything that had come before and everything that would follow. The boardroom remained silent for several long seconds after my revelation. I could see the information rippling through the assembled directors, shock giving way to reassessment as they mentally recontextualized everything they'd witnessed over the past week. Patrick's face had drained of color, his carefully constructed, professional facade crumbling before the board's collective gaze. This was the moment he had always feared, the collision of his compartmentalized worlds, the exposure of his personal conduct to professional scrutiny. William Harper broke the silence, his tone carefully measured. "Mr. Reynolds, is this accurate? You were previously married to Ms. Reynolds?" Patrick straightened his tie, a nervous habit I remembered well. "Yes," he admitted stiffly. "But that personal history has no bearing on the financial matters under discussion." "I would argue it has significant bearing," Eleanor Blackwood countered. "Not on the financial evidence itself, which stands on its own merits, but on your claim that Ms. Reynolds is pursuing a vendetta rather than acting in the company's best interests." James Morrison nodded in agreement. "Context matters, especially when one party is accusing the other of personal bias." I remained composed, allowing the board members to process this new information without further comment from me. The revelation had been calculated, not to elicit sympathy, but to expose the hollow foundation of Patrick's accusations against me. "Perhaps," William suggested, "we should take a brief recess to consider this information and its relevance to the matters at hand." As the board members filed out, Patrick remained seated, staring at the audit documents before him. When the room had emptied except for us, he finally looked up, his expression a complex mixture of anger and fear. "Was that really necessary?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "Bringing our personal history into a board meeting?" "You brought it up first," I reminded him. "I simply provided the full context rather than your sanitized version." He slammed his palm against the table, a rare display of uncontrolled emotion. "This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I was talking about. You're deliberately conflating business decisions with personal history to turn the board against me." "The audit findings turned the board against you, Patrick," I replied calmly. "I merely prevented you from using our previous acquaintance as a shield against legitimate scrutiny." Before he could respond, the door opened and William Harper returned earlier than expected. His expression was grave as he addressed Patrick. "Mr. Reynolds, the executive committee has requested an immediate private session with you. They're waiting in the small conference room." Patrick rose, adjusting his jacket with deliberate dignity. "This isn't over," he said quietly to me before following William out. In the 20 minutes that followed, The ripple effects of the revelation spread beyond the boardroom. Abigail appeared with updates from throughout the building. The executive floor was buzzing with speculation. Operations staff were gathered in nervous clusters, and 3 different financial news outlets had called requesting comment on the unscheduled board meeting. When the board members finally returned, their expressions told me everything I needed to know. William Harper took his seat at the head of the table, the authority in his bearing more pronounced than before. After careful consideration, he announced, the board has reached several unanimous decisions. He turned to me first. Ms. Reynolds, your strategic vision for Horizon Energy's renewable transformation is approved in its entirety, with the full funding allocations you requested. A wave of vindication washed over me, though I maintained my professional composure. Thank you, Chairman Harper. The leadership team is prepared to begin implementation immediately. Additionally, he continued, in light of the audit findings, the board has placed Patrick Reynolds on administrative leave pending a complete investigation of the financial discrepancies identified. Frank Wilson has also been suspended from his CFO duties until the investigation is complete. The pronouncement fell like a gavel, final and irrevocable. Patrick's carefully constructed kingdom had collapsed in less than an hour, years of manipulation and misrepresentation exposed under the unforgiving light of objective financial evidence. The board has also determined, William added, looking directly at me, that while the personal history between you and Mr. Reynolds is unfortunate, it does not constitute a conflict of interest that would impact your ability to lead Horizon Energy. Your decisions have been substantiated by independent analysis and align with the company's long-term interests. Thank you for your confidence, I replied. I assure you that all my actions as CEO have been and will continue to be guided by what's best for Horizon, its employees, and its shareholders. The meeting concluded with a discussion of next steps, an interim CFO appointment, communication strategy for the organizational changes, and implementation timeline for the renewable transformation. Throughout these practical conversations, I felt a profound sense of closure that went beyond professional validation. After the board members departed, I took a moment alone in the empty boardroom. 7 years of proving myself, of rebuilding my life and career from the devastation Patrick had left behind. All of it had culminated in this moment of comprehensive vindication. My phone buzzed with a text from Carrie. Just heard the news. Patrick was escorted from the building. Security is sealing his office now. Congratulations, CEO. I smiled, remembering Patrick's words the night he'd left me. You'll never succeed without me. You're not cut out for this world. How wrong he had. As I gathered my materials to leave, William Harper reappeared at the doorway. Ms. Reynolds, a word before you go? I nodded, and he closed the door behind him. That was quite a revelation, he said, though I suspect several board members already knew some version of your history with Patrick. I never intended to use it as leverage, I assured him. The audit findings speak for themselves. Indeed they do, he agreed. But I'm curious. Was this position simply about revenge? About proving something to your ex-husband? I considered his question carefully. When Bill Hargrove first approached me about the CEO position, I won't deny that the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities to Patrick held a certain appeal. But that was never my primary motivation. And what was? William asked. Horizon Energy has incredible potential that's been systematically suppressed, I replied honestly. The renewable division alone could transform this company's future if properly supported. I took this position because I genuinely believe I can lead that transformation successfully. William studied me for a moment, then nodded with apparent satisfaction. That's precisely what Bill said when he recommended you, that your personal history with Patrick might provide extra motivation, but your qualifications and vision were what Horizon truly needed. He extended his hand. The board is fully behind you, Ms. Reynolds. Make the most of this opportunity. As I shook his hand, I felt the weight of the past 7 years lifting. The ripples from today's revelation would continue spreading throughout Horizon Energy and beyond, reshaping the company, redefining relationships, and opening possibilities that Patrick's leadership had deliberately constrained. But most importantly, they had finally washed away the last lingering doubts about my own capabilities, not in the board's eyes, but in my own. The weekend after the board meeting gave me time to process everything that had happened. I took Lily to her favorite park on Saturday, watching her fearlessly climb the jungle gym while I sat on a nearby bench, my mind drifting between the personal and professional transformations of the past week. "Mom, watch this," she called, hanging upside down, her long dark hair cascading toward the ground, her smile radiant with the simple joy of childhood achievement. I clapped appropriately, marveling at her confidence and resilience. Unlike me, Lily had never known a time when she doubted her capabilities. From her earliest years, I had deliberately nurtured her self-belief, determined that she would never internalize the limitations that Patrick had tried to impose on me. "Be careful, but brave," I'd always told her, a mantra that had become my own guiding principle as well. On Sunday evening, as I prepared for the week ahead, Carrie called with updates from her network of sources at Horizon. "The audit team spent the entire weekend going through Patrick's files," she reported. "Apparently, they've uncovered evidence that the financial manipulation went even deeper than we initially thought. There's talk of potential shareholder lawsuits once this becomes public." I sighed, feeling strangely conflicted. I wanted accountability, not destruction. "This isn't your doing, Miranda," Carrie reminded me gently. "Patrick made these choices consistently over years. You simply brought them to light." After we hung up, I found myself staring at an old photograph I kept tucked away in my desk drawer. Patrick and me on our wedding day, both smiling, full of hope for the future we would build together. The contrast between that hopeful young woman and the CEO who had just orchestrated her ex-husband's professional downfall was stark. Yet I felt no triumph in Patrick's disgrace, only a somber recognition of how ambition untethered from integrity had corroded his character over time. When had he changed from the passionate energy innovator I'd fallen in love with to the manipulative executive who valued control above all else? Or had that darker aspect always been present, simply concealed, until he felt threatened by my success? Monday morning brought a fresh wave of challenges as I officially announced the leadership changes and strategic pivot to Horizon's employees. Standing in the company auditorium before hundreds of faces reflecting emotions ranging from excitement to anxiety, I recognized that this moment transcended my personal journey with Patrick. "Horizon Energy stands at a crossroads," I began, conscious that my words would define not just the company's direction, but the culture we would build going forward. For too long, we've allowed short-term thinking to constrain our potential. Today, we choose a different path, one that honors our traditional energy expertise while boldly embracing the renewable future our world desperately needs. As I outlined the practical implications of our strategic shift, new investments, reorganized departments, changed priorities, I emphasized one theme above all others: transparency. The leadership changes announced today reflect our commitment to honest communication and financial integrity, I explained, careful not to directly reference Patrick or the specific findings. Every employee deserves to know that their work contributes to a company that operates with the highest ethical standards. The applause that followed felt like endorsement not just of the strategy, but of the values it represented. In that moment, I understood that what had begun as a personal journey of vindication had evolved into something far more meaningful, an opportunity to transform not just Horizon Energy's business model, but its fundamental approach to leadership. Later that day, as I met with the Renewable Division to formalize their expanded role, Frank Carter expressed what many seemed to be feeling. "For years, we felt like we were fighting the company to do what the company claimed it wanted," he said, emotion evident in his voice. Having leadership that actually believes in our work, it changes everything. His words resonated deeply. How many times in my marriage had I felt exactly that way, fighting against Patrick's constraints to pursue goals he claimed to support? The parallel between my personal experience and Horizon's organizational dynamics was striking. By channeling my own hard-won resilience into reshaping Horizon's culture, I was creating something constructive from the painful lessons of my past. What Patrick had intended for harm, his abandonment, his dismissal of my capabilities, had ultimately forged the determination and clarity of purpose that now enabled me to lead effectively. That evening, Abigail brought in the preliminary market. Response to our announced changes, Horizon stock had jumped 8% in a single day, with analysts praising the company's bold strategic realignment and forward-thinking leadership. The renewable sector analysts are particularly enthusiastic, she noted. 3 have already upgraded our rating based on the accelerated transition timeline. I nodded, pleased but not surprised. The business case for our strategic pivot had always been solid. It had simply been suppressed by Patrick's personal agenda and short-term profit focus. As I prepared to leave for the day, my phone buzzed with an unexpected text. We need to talk. Not about Horizon, about Lily. I stared at the message, feeling the complex emotions it triggered. In the whirlwind of professional consequences, I'd given little thought to how these changes would affect Patrick's relationship with our daughter. Though never deeply involved in her life, he had maintained the minimal visitation schedule established in our divorce agreement. After a moment's consideration, I replied, tomorrow, 7 p.m., neutral location, the cafe near Lily's school. His response came quickly. I'll be there. Driving home, I reflected on how this situation embodied the expanding ripples of consequence, from the personal to the professional and back again. Patrick's abandonment of me had shaped my professional development, which had ultimately led to his professional downfall, which would now potentially reshape his relationship with Lily. The narrative had expanded far beyond simple revenge, becoming a complex web of actions, consequences, and transformations that touched every aspect of our interconnected lives. As I pulled into my driveway, I spotted Lily's face pressed against the window, waiting eagerly for my return. Her unrestrained joy at my arrival was a powerful reminder of what truly mattered beyond corporate battles and professional vindication. I had once feared that Patrick's abandonment would define both my life and Lily's. Instead, it had become merely one chapter in a much richer, more complex story. A story about resilience, growth, and the capacity to transform painful experiences into sources of strength and wisdom. Tomorrow's conversation with Patrick would be difficult, but I would approach it not as the wounded ex-wife or the triumphant CEO, but as someone who understood that true success wasn't measured by revenge, but by creating something meaningful from adversity. And by that measure, I had already won. The cafe near Lily's school was deliberately neutral territory, neither the corporate battlefield of Horizon Energy nor the personal space of my home. I arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table that offered both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. Patrick appeared precisely at 7, punctuality being one of his few consistent virtues. He looked different somehow, the confident executive, polish diminished, replaced by something more subdued. He wore casual clothes rather than his usual tailored suit, and the dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Miranda, he greeted me with a nod, sliding into the seat across from me. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I studied him, trying to see beyond my preconceptions. You wanted to talk about Lily. He nodded, his fingers nervously adjusting his, coffee cup. With everything that's happened at Horizon, I'm concerned about how it might affect her. Kids at school talking, questions she might have. The genuine concern in his voice surprised me. Patrick had never shown much interest in the nuances of Lily's emotional world before, She knows the basics of our history, I replied carefully. That we were married, that you left before she was born, that you have a new family now. She doesn't know about the professional situation yet. He winced slightly at my blunt recounting. I deserve that. But Lily doesn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of our professional conflict. No, she doesn't, I agreed, which is why I haven't discussed Horizon's leadership changes with her. Patrick looked relieved, then hesitant. There's something else. Aileen and we're separating. The revelation caught me off guard. Patrick and Aileen's relationship had outlasted our marriage by several years, producing 2 children of their own. I'd assumed their connection was stronger than what he and I had shared. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, surprised to find I meant it. Despite everything, I took no pleasure in additional family disruption that would affect innocent children. Are you? He asked, a hint of bitterness creeping into his tone. After what happened at Horizon, I would think you'd consider it appropriate karma. I never wanted revenge on your personal life, Patrick, I replied honestly. Only professional? Accountability for professional misconduct. He laughed humorlessly, a convenient distinction, but the audit findings have leaked to Aileen's family. Her father is on the board of Atlantic Petroleum. The scandal is affecting their business relationships. And now she's blaming me for putting our family's reputation and financial security at risk. I absorbed this information, recognizing the complex ripple effects extending far beyond what I'd anticipated or intended. Patrick's professional disgrace was bleeding into his personal life, just as he had once allowed our personal relationship to influence his professional judgment. That must be difficult, I acknowledged, unsure what else to say. It's ironic, he continued, staring into his coffee. Aileen was so convinced I was her knight in shining armor when I left you for her. Now she's seeing the same flaws you experienced. The candid admission surprised me. In all our interactions since the divorce, Patrick had never acknowledged any personal responsibility for our failed marriage. People change, I offered neutrally. Do they? He looked up, meeting my gaze directly. Or do they just reveal who they truly are under pressure? You certainly did. I tensed, anticipating an attack, but his expression wasn't hostile. The way you handled everything at Horizon, he continued, it was impressive. Ruthlessly effective, but impressive. Nothing like the uncertain analyst I married, or even the angry ex-wife I divorced. Parenthood changes you, I replied. So does betrayal. And 7 years of proving yourself in an industry that constantly underestimates you. He nodded slowly. I underestimated you most of all. The acknowledgement, so long awaited, felt strangely hollow now that it had finally arrived. I didn't need Patrick's validation anymore, hadn't needed it for years, though I hadn't fully realized that until this moment. Why did you really want to meet Patrick? I asked directly. It wasn't just concern about Lily overhearing school gossip. He sighed, shoulders slumping slightly. I wanted to understand. How did you do it? Transform from the woman I knew to this? CEO, strategic visionary, the person who systematically dismantled everything I built? You mean, how did I succeed without you? I clarified, remembering his parting words from 7 years ago. Because I never needed you to succeed, Patrick. I needed you to stop actively undermining me. Once you were gone, my path became clearer, not harder. He flinched at the brutal honesty, but nodded for me to continue. After you left, I had 2 choices, I explained. Collapse under the weight of single motherhood and professional setbacks, or harness that pain into something constructive. I chose the latter. Every time someone doubted me because I was a single mother, every time a door closed because of your industry connections, I found another way forward. And built a reputation strong enough for Bill Hargrove to recruit you specifically to replace me, Patrick concluded, the irony clearly not lost on him. Not to replace you, I corrected. To fix what you'd broken at Horizon. There's a difference. We sat in silence for a moment, the years of hurt and resentment between us somehow both present and diminished. I saw Patrick now not as the monster of my painful memories, nor as the corporate villain I'd exposed, but as a flawed human whose worst instincts had ultimately sabotaged what should have been a brilliant career. What happens now? He finally asked. The audit findings. They're career-ending, aren't they? I considered my response carefully. The financial manipulation was systematic and deliberate. There will be consequences, both legal and professional. But your future depends partly on how you respond to those findings. Meaning, accepting responsibility rather than deflecting it would be a start, I suggested. Cooperating fully with the investigation rather than fighting it. Demonstrating that you understand the ethical breaches involved. He studied me curiously. That sounds like you're offering advice rather than celebrating my downfall. Believe it or not, Patrick, your complete destruction was never my goal, I replied honestly. Professional accountability was, and regardless of our past, you're still Lily's father. I'd prefer she not see her father completely disgraced if there's a path to redemption. This seemed to affect him deeply. For perhaps the first time, he was seeing me not as an opponent to defeat or an ex-wife to dismiss, but as someone with a complex moral perspective beyond simple revenge. I don't know if I can be the father Lily deserves, he admitted quietly. I've made such a mess of everything. Parenthood isn't about perfection, I told him. It's about presence and effort. You've provided financial support, but little else. She deserves more, not for my sake, but for hers. Patrick nodded slowly. I'd like to try. To be more involved, if you're willing to allow it. That's Lily's decision more than mine, I replied. She's old enough now to have a say in how much time she spends with you. But I won't stand in the way if you're genuinely committed to being a consistent presence in her life. As our conversation drew to a close, I realized how far we'd both traveled from the people we once were. The young, insecure woman desperate for Patrick's approval had evolved into someone secure enough to offer compassion to the man who had once devastated her. And Patrick, confronted with the consequences of his actions, seemed to be grappling with genuine self-reflection for perhaps the first time. I never congratulated you properly, he said as we prepared to leave. On the CEO position. Whatever our history, you've earned it. Thank you, I replied simply, accepting the acknowledgement without needing it. Outside the cafe, as we prepared to go our separate ways, Patrick hesitated. For what it's worth, Miranda, I'm sorry, not just for the professional conflict, but for how I treated you during our marriage and after. You deserved better. The apology, 7 years late, landed in a heart that had already healed itself without it. Yet I recognized its significance, not for my benefit, but for his. We can't change the past, I told him, but we can choose how it shapes our future. Good night, Patrick. As I drove home, I reflected on the unexpected complexity of the evening's conversation. What I had anticipated as a tense discussion about keeping our professional conflict away from Lily had evolved into something far more nuanced, a moment of genuine connection and potential growth. The simple revenge narrative I had perhaps unconsciously embraced had given way to something far more complicated and ultimately more satisfying. The recognition that true empowerment came not from defeating one's opponents, but from transcending the need to define oneself in opposition to them. Patrick would face the consequences of his actions, both professionally and personally, but my own journey had evolved beyond the need to witness or orchestrate his downfall. The woman who had once felt devastated by his betrayal had become someone whose identity and worth existed completely independent of his recognition or approval. And that, I realized, was the most profound victory of all. 6 months after that pivotal board meeting, I found myself standing on stage at the Women in Energy Leadership Conference, invited to deliver the keynote address. The audience of 500 women, ranging from early career professionals to established executives, represented every sector of the industry. As I looked out at their faces, I saw reflections of my own journey. Women who had faced dismissal and underestimation, who had been told either explicitly or implicitly that their ambitions were unreasonable, their capabilities insufficient, their priorities misaligned. My story has made the rounds in industry circles, I began, acknowledging the whispers and headlines that had followed Horizon's leadership change. The abandoned pregnant wife who became CEO of her ex-husband's company. It's a catchy narrative, the kind that makes for compelling gossip at networking events. Knowing laughter rippled through the audience. But I'm not here to tell you that story again. I'm here to tell you what that experience taught me about power, resilience, and the journey each of us faces in reclaiming our narrative. I moved away from the podium, choosing to walk the stage and connect more directly with the women before me. When my husband walked out on me at 6 months pregnant, telling me I'd never succeed without him, I believed him. Not immediately, but gradually, as doors closed, as opportunities vanished, as former colleagues suddenly became unavailable for meetings. His words became a poisonous seed in my mind, growing with each setback until his assessment seemed prophetic. I paused, letting that confession settle. Many women nodded in recognition of how easily self-doubt takes root when planted by someone we once trusted. The turning point came not when I proved him wrong, though I eventually did, but when I stopped measuring my worth by his standards altogether. My journey wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about reclaiming my own vision of success. I shared specific moments from my journey. The first major client I landed as a single mother working from a home office with a newborn nearby. The innovative renewable energy solution I developed that eventually caught Bill Hargrove's attention. The daily small acts of courage required to push forward in an industry that often viewed my motherhood as a liability rather than a source of strength. The narrative of revenge makes for exciting headlines, I continued. But the deeper truth is that success isn't about defeating those who doubted you. It's about transcending the need for their validation entirely. I moved to the heart of what I wanted these women to understand, the message that went beyond my personal story. Each of you has faced your own version of that dismissive voice, perhaps from a boss, a colleague, a partner, or even your own internal critic. The voice that says you're not enough, not smart enough, not tough enough, not dedicated enough. The voice that places artificial limitations on your potential based on your gender, your family status, or your background. I looked directly at different sections of the audience, connecting with as many women as possible. Here's what I want you to know. That voice is wrong. Not because you're perfect or because success is guaranteed, but because your capabilities cannot be accurately judged by someone with limited vision and their own agenda. The energy in the room intensified as I continued. The most damaging power we give others is the power to define our limitations. Take that power back, not with anger or resentment, but with the quiet determination to define success on your own terms. I shared how motherhood, rather than limiting my professional capabilities as Patrick had predicted, had actually enhanced them, teaching me efficiency, perspective, and an ability to focus on what truly mattered. The skills you develop navigating your unique challenges, whether balancing family responsibilities, overcoming institutional barriers, or rebuilding after personal setbacks, these become your competitive advantages when properly leveraged. Walked to the center of the stage, my voice growing more passionate. When I became CEO of Horizon Energy, the media painted it as the ultimate revenge story. But the truth is far more powerful. I didn't take that position to get revenge on my ex-husband. I took it because I was the right person to lead the company through a necessary transformation. A transformation that happens to benefit our planet's future as well as our shareholders. The audience applauded, and I waited for the noise to subside before delivering the most important part of my message. So here is what I want each of you to take from my journey. Your worth is not determined by those who failed to see your potential. Your capabilities are not limited by someone else's inability to recognize them. Your future is not defined by those who walked away when you needed them most. I paused, making eye contact with younger women in the front rows. Instead of proving your doubters wrong, focus on proving yourself right. Instead of seeking validation from those who underestimated you, create such undeniable value that their opinions become irrelevant. Instead of allowing rejection to diminish you, let it refine you. The energy in the room was palpable now, a collective recognition of shared struggles and possibilities. The path forward isn't easy. There will be days when self-doubt feels overwhelming, when the barriers seem insurmountable, when balancing competing demands feels impossible. On those days, remember this: you are not alone in this journey. Every woman in this room has faced her own version of these challenges, and many of us have discovered that our greatest moments of growth often follow our most painful setbacks. I shared how Horizon Energy had transformed under my leadership, not just financially, but culturally. How we'd implemented family-friendly policies, mentorship programs specifically for women in STEM roles, and transparency and promotion practices that had already increased female representation in leadership by 40%. This isn't just about individual achievement. It's about changing the environments we work in so that the next generation of women doesn't face the same artificial limitations. Each of you has the power to create those changes within your sphere of influence, however large or small. As I moved toward my conclusion, I wanted to leave them with actionable wisdom rather than just inspiration. I'll leave you with 3 specific practices that helped me transform pain into power. First, maintain meticulous documentation of your achievements and contributions. When others try to minimize or appropriate your work, facts are your strongest defense. Second, build genuine alliances with people of integrity, regardless of gender. My path to CEO was supported by both women and men who recognized value rather than gender. And third, define success for yourself rather than accepting someone else's definition. My ex-husband saw success as power over others. I came to see it as the ability to transform organizations and create opportunities for others. I returned to the podium for my final thoughts. The most powerful moment in my journey wasn't becoming CEO or watching my ex-husband face consequences for his actions. It was the moment I realized I no longer needed his acknowledgement of my worth. True empowerment comes not from external validation, but from that internal certainty that you know who you are and what you're capable of, regardless of who believes in you. I looked out at the sea of faces, women at different stages of their own journeys of challenge and triumph. So yes, I became my ex-husband's CEO. But the real victory wasn't taking his position. It was claiming my own power so completely that his opinion of me became irrelevant. That's the victory I wish for, each of you. Not revenge, but complete liberation from the need for validation from those who underestimated you. The audience rose in a standing ovation, the response reflecting not just appreciation for my story, but recognition of their own struggles and triumphs mirrored in it. As I accepted their applause, I thought of Lily, now 8 years old, who would grow up in a world still full of challenges for ambitious women, but also in a world where her mother and countless women like those before me had pushed boundaries and redefined possibilities. The true power of my journey wasn't in proving Patrick wrong. It was in creating a legacy of resilience and transformation that would ripple outward far beyond one company or one personal victory. Touching the lives of women I would never meet, women who might find in my story the courage to reclaim their own narrative and transform setbacks into strength. That was a victory worth fighting for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.